All right. So first thing, let's just talk through some of the truths about selling, upselling, what makes it good, what makes it bad. So there's nothing wrong with making money. I think we can all attest to that. We deserve to make a good living for what we do. We have skills. I'm not a big fan of people who bash companies based on their pricing structures or based on things that are just them doing good business. So communication skills, that's just good business. So being good at sales means that you're good at talking with people, you're good at communicating, you're good at pricing. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with taking classes and things like that in order to get better at that. There's nothing wrong with empathy. Some of the best salespeople out there are really good at relating to customers. That's natural. That's good. That's something that leads to sales, and nothing wrong with that. I don't have a problem with people who take courses learning how to communicate better, how to be more empathetic with customers, all that stuff. There's nothing wrong with open questions. So asking customers questions so you can better understand their needs, so you can help to challenge some assumptions that they have. That's something that you do with open questioning, is you challenge assumptions, and that's healthy. A lot of people misunderstand things. A common one would be people think bigger is better. They think they need a larger air conditioner in order to get the job done. So asking open questions allows you to challenge assumptions. Those are all good things. There's nothing wrong with that. Those are skills to learn. There are people who are good at it, and they're going to sell more because of that. And that is all a good idea. Providing excellent solutions, so having really good solutions to provide to the customer. You're offering good equipment. You're offering good matches. You're doing load calculations. You're inspecting ductwork. You have a good reputation. Those are all things that are really good and important. And I know this is obvious, I'm speaking to the choir here, but this is sometimes companies that charge a lot of money get criticized for charging a lot of money, and they charge a lot of money because they're doing these things well. And I do not criticize that, because there's nothing wrong with making a good living, like I just keep saying here. Keeping your word. So if you say you're going to show up at a certain time, you show up at a certain time. If you say you're going to install a certain thing, you install a certain thing. If you say you're going to solve a particular airflow problem, then you solve the particular airflow problem. If you say you're going to reduce their humidity, or you're going to increase their humidity, or you're going to make them comfortable, or you're going to filter out particles, or you're going to reduce viruses, or whatever you say you're going to do, that you actually do it, right? Those are all things that make a good ethical company. And it's okay to charge a good, solid amount of money and make really nice profit and have a nice life to do those things, because those are things that very few people can do well. And actually, I want to bring Reagan on quickly, because Reagan is a business owner. He runs a really respected business in San Antonio. So is there anything you would add to that list, Reagan? Oh, I got him on hold here.
Hey, Brian.
Hey.
Take me a minute. Sorry. Anything that I would add to that? Yeah, I mean, no, not really. I mean, you don't want to screw people over. I don't.
But how do you define that?
Sorry, I'm outside trying to do it.
I know you're trying to do a lot of things at once. I understand you're trying to eat a meal while you're trying to moderate, and I'm asking you questions in the middle of a live show. That's, so you have to multitask. That's another thing you have to do. So when you say not to screw people over, what does that mean to you, though? Because I think, and the reason why I ask that is because a lot of people will call charging. We get this a lot, and I use these as examples because I do not charge these prices. But people will say, well, if you charge $250 for a capacitor replacement, you're screwing someone over. That's not my definition. But how do you think about that?
I think that your prices are your prices. So if you're upfront with your prices, you let them know what it costs, then you're giving them the decision. But what you don't want to do is promise things that are not going to happen. If they have old equipment, you need to let them know that, it could last, you want us to replace the capacitor on it. It could last 10 minutes, or it could last another 10 years. Like, you just have no idea. But you want to make sure that they're aware of all the possible outcomes of any decision that you're presenting them with.
Somebody's saying that you can't hear Reagan. I want to make sure that you can hear him. So just somebody let me know that you can definitely hear him. Yeah, and so communication is all about building appropriate expectations. It's about doing what you say you're going to do and doing it in a high quality way that's going to last, that's going to work well for the customer. But to me, it's not about having cheap prices. I mean, I don't care if somebody wants to quote customers $1,000 an hour, then I'm totally fine with that. I don't think that that's going to work for them as a business model. But they can, as long as they're upfront about it and they're clear about it and their pricing, and they're not saying that they're the cheapest in town. Well, then I'm totally fine with them doing business in that way. That is a controversial topic because a lot of people get hung up on what they call fair pricing, and to them, fair pricing is pricing that's similar to others. Well, the problem with that is that there's a lot of companies that aren't really making a profit. And they're not building good quality businesses. They're not doing things the way that we talk about on the HVAC School podcast. So anyway, those are the...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Fair pricing is what you need to support your business. I mean, you have to look at your own overhead and whatever you can do to support your business. As long as you're presenting the pricing to the customer and they have the option to say yes or no,
yeah,
then I don't care what other people what people charge.
Yeah, and that's so somebody already in chat said $200 for a capacitor. That's crazy. Again, this is we're going to get in arguments in this podcast. By the way, that's fine. And if you want to call, then feel free to call in because these are the sorts of things we're going to discuss. I don't think that pricing is the problem. I think that integrity and honesty is the problem, and that if you're not doing this list of things, then to me that's a problem. I don't have a problem with companies that are straight shooters, communicate clearly, and charge high prices. And again, because people will say, well, if you're worth it. Well, worth is different people value different things. I think as long as you're being really honest and forthright and communicating well, pricing to me is not a moral issue. It's just pricing. You set your price based on what you want to set your price as. It's the same as, because people will say this, they'll say, well, that price is too much. Well, if you go to a high-end steakhouse, do you expect that to be the same price as Outback? Do you expect that to be the same price as McDonald's? Is it unethical for Delmonico's to charge, $80 for a steak? Is that unethical when you could go buy a hamburger for $2? No, it's not unethical. People make choices based on their own values. And the idea that we're in a commodity business where everything's the same and everybody who changes a capacitor is the same and everybody who diagnoses the system is the same, that's silly. Now, if you are making false claims, saying you're the best, saying you're doing all this stuff, and then you're not doing it, that to me is the problem. Or you're selling people on solutions that aren't doing the things that you're telling them that they do, then to me that is the problem. And again, I don't charge super premium prices in my company, but that's a choice. That's a business choice. I don't fault other people who do, so long as they're backing up what they say with reality. The problem that I see is that a lot of times companies that are charging premium prices are not actually premium companies. So you're getting a McDonald's hamburger at the Delmonico's price, and that to me is the issue. If you tell somebody you're gonna give them, A+ prime, steak, and then you hand them a hamburger, that's the problem, not the fact that you're charging high prices. And again, some people will say, well, yeah, but a capacitor is the same for everybody. That's true, but you know very well that some companies are being really thorough with the equipment as part of that, and some aren't. Some are taking it and leaving it in the box and throwing it in the compartment, and some are actually strapping it properly and making sure the connectors are snug and neatening the wires and all those sorts of things, which, to some of us we may say, well, that's not worth that additional money, but that's not for us to decide. Customers have the opportunity to choose whether or not they value that or not. And to me, that's really important. All right, so moving on.
Yeah, it's not great radio, but I would agree with you on pretty much all of that.
What's not great radio? You don't like my podcast? You don't like this? You think this stinks?
No, I'm saying it's not great radio to not disagree with you.
Oh, okay, right. Disagreeing with me makes for better radio.
Sort of further, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so
I'll find something else to disagree with.
Good. That's what I want. I want arguments. I want screaming and PG swearing. So lots of "you're full of crap," stuff like that. All right, so here's where I see the problem. This is my list of things that I see as the problem. I'm going to go ahead and make myself disappear so you can see this. Selling products when you aren't clear on the benefit yourself. And that's a really common one, even for high-end companies. They sell products because they make a lot of money, but they're not really clear on what it does. They know it does some good things, maybe, and we're going to talk about indoor air quality and Hardstart kits today, and those are two that are really common that way. Overselling results the customer won't receive. So selling products and saying that it's going to have a particular result when it doesn't have that result. Using fear as a selling tactic. I mean, that's an old one with people saying, "Oh, your unit's full of mold, ma'am," and all that sort of thing. And a lot of times that happens because technicians are convincing themselves that that's true. And so I just make the absolute rule that just don't use fear to sell. Fear is not a good way to sell things. Instead, use education, ask open questions, and if the customer has those fears, they will reveal them themselves rather than you having to be the one to trigger those. And to me, this is what happens all the time. People look for products with big margins that they can shoehorn into customers' houses. So they say, man, this is a product I can make a lot of money on. I can make a lot of commissions. I can make a lot of spiffs, whatever on. And so now I'm going to figure out how to sell this to as many customers as possible. And to me, that's just poison. There's nothing wrong with finding products that you can make good margins on. I don't think there's nothing wrong with that. But taking those products and now trying to jam them into every application, it's that whole thing of, when all you have in your hand is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. That becomes the issue. And that's the problem that I have as we're going to talk about things like UVC. I don't have a problem with the technology. The technology is good. The technology is proven. It's valuable. I have a problem with the way that technicians and salespeople start to use that as the solution to everything. Because it's something that they know they can sell, and they can sell at big margins, and they can sell with a lot of commissions and a lot of profit. Nothing wrong, again, with making profit. Nothing wrong with having high margins. To me, that's great. That's the American dream, right? But you have to do it honestly, and you have to give people products that are going to fit their need, not shoehorn, some product into telling the customer that it's going to solve all their problems when it's not the best solution for them, or not a good solid solution even for certain outcomes. So let's talk about that. And now this is where, okay, so I already got warned. Neil Comparetto told me that if I keep talking about indoor air quality, that I'm going to have a security detail because I'm constantly ticking people off with indoor air quality. And I don't mean to. It's just that this is a question that I get all the time because when I talk about indoor air quality, people get the sense that I like or don't like certain products. And now there is some truth to that because I use certain products and I don't use other products. And to that extent, I guess I like certain products and dislike others. But a better way to think about it is that I don't like a lot of products in every situation. And that's what it comes down to. And I don't like products without the people who are selling the products understanding the products better than they often do. And just to be clear, because I think a lot of people get the sense that I'm this self-righteous schmuck, which maybe I am. That might be fair. I've made all these mistakes. Pretty much every mistake you can make, I've made. And a lot of my motivation was never I've never been money motivated. I've never wanted to get rich. I've never wanted to optimize for that. But sometimes it's just being impatient. And so you hear a product, it sounds good, it gets sold to you, and you just start to sell it to customers because it's, really researching it takes a lot of time and it gets frustrating, which I completely understand. But as it relates to IAQ, especially right now, there's so much misinformation and people are really looking to HVAC contractors to help solve a problem. And the problem that they're really looking to solve right now is coronavirus. And the reality is that there's not a whole lot that you're going to do in an air conditioning system that's going to reliably deal with coronavirus. There are a few things, and we're going to talk about those, but a lot of the products that get sold aren't going to reliably deal with coronavirus. So Reagan said, Caleb, be ready, and I am going to bring Caleb on now because this is one of his favorite topics. And so I want to hear, Caleb, before I go through this list, because I'm sure you're looking at it here on the screen. Which of these products do you like? Which ones don't you like? Just go through this quickly and give me your take on these.
All right. First, can you hear me?
I can hear you
well.
I can hear you great.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Yeah, so pretty much all of the ones that you have in the clearly proven everywhere section are perfectly fine in almost any application. Even UVC as a surface sanitizer can be perfectly fine in most applications. It's not necessarily that I don't like PCO or bipolar or ionization, but it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution for residential applications, given a lot of variables. So those are some things to think about when you're weighing the risk-benefit factors of certain products. You need to know third-party peer-reviewed studies, not company-funded studies.
Your audio is getting really quiet. So, yes, peer-reviewed studies that are done by real scientists studying this stuff is great. The problem is, and this is a real problem, and I feel for the companies that make these products, is that scientists aren't necessarily studying the things we would want them to study. And so sometimes they will fund research. But the problem when they fund research is that a lot of times they impact the results of that research. That's just the reality. And so what I want to see more of, honestly, in the short term, is a lot more good, solid before and after case studies. To me, that's something that we can get more quickly without the need to have scientific, peer-reviewed data. Although I want that more, and I think the home chem study's been doing a really good job about that. But in the meantime, I think we as contractors need to be a lot more proactive in measuring what we can measure, and that's using things, like, for example, I'm using the laser egg, which is one of my favorite current products for the consumer to measure CO2 and to measure VOCs, depending on which one you get, and to look at PM 2.5, which is 2.5 micron particles that are the ones that are the most dangerous, and to look carefully at these things so that way we can see where we stand. Are we making a difference? Are we moving the needle forward when we put in certain products? I'm also a fan, and I don't have a slide for this, I'm just mentioning it here. I'm also a fan of using Petri dishes, which I know is a controversial thing to do, but at least it's better than not doing anything. So taking a Petri dish, leaving it out for 5 minutes, closing it up, seeing what's in the air, and then after you make a change, see if there has been any significant change. Now, that doesn't deal with things like incomplete degradation, which we're going to talk about quickly, because we've talked about these things so much. But at least it can show, is there a change that's occurring? Or is it making some difference? Because we know that a lot of these technologies, it's not that they don't work necessarily, it's that they can have unintended consequences. A perfect example being O3, being ozone. Ozone was used to remove odors. They used to put it in, we used to have one, we would put it in a room and it would run and it would oxidize and it would, reduce odors. But we also found out that it itself would attack, the membranes inside your respiratory system and would make people have worse symptoms. And so much of what we're doing is trying to reduce people's symptoms, trying to make them feel better in their houses. And so while O3 was killing stuff and was neutralizing odors, it was causing another problem. And it was in turn making people sick in certain circumstances. So these are things that we learn over time. And so that's why I'm always really careful when we're using active products. And so the active products on this list here are PCO, bipolar cold plasma. Those are the ones that I'm a little more nervous about, with PCO being the one I'm probably most nervous about to put in customers' houses. Now, here's the part I'm going to slow down, and I want you to hear me very carefully. I have a PCO in my own house. I don't know if you know this, Caleb. Yeah, you did. We talked about it. I have a PCO in my own house because even with all the research that I've done, I'm not actually concerned about it in my house. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm right, and it also doesn't mean that I'm going to throw it at all of my customers' houses. It's just that I'm not a particularly worried person. And so I can see that PCO does make a difference with some of this stuff, and so I'm comfortable using it. I also use a product that I'm pretty comfortable. It doesn't have incomplete degradation to the extent that some products may have, and it also isn't a high producer of ozone. Now, I say that so that you understand that, because people will sometimes think that I'm crapping on all these products, and I'm not. What I'm crapping on is people who aren't looking carefully at it and who are using it with customers who are highly sensitive, and they're using it telling them that it's going to kill things that it hasn't been proven to kill. and without telling them that, yes, there are some products that do produce small levels of ozone. Yes, there are some products that do have the risk of having incomplete degradation. But let's focus on the good part here, which is this top list. Media filters with large surface area and low velocity, great. They're excellent. Even if you're doing filter returns and you're just using larger filter returns, so you have lower face velocity with higher MERV ratings, that's great. Better ventilation, bringing in outdoor air at appropriate times, helping to keep CO2 levels low, helping to keep VOCs diluted, that's great. Keeping your humidity under control, important. HEPA filtration is awesome. I don't know why we haven't been using. I mean, I'm on this big HEPA filtration jag right now. You can get these relatively inexpensive HEPA filters that go along with your AC. They only filter a portion of the air. You can't run all of your airflow through it because it would be too restrictive. But they filter a portion of your air continuously. To me, that's a great technology. Activated carbon, a great technology. The challenge is you do have to replace it, and there's varying qualities of activated carbon. But all of these have been tested. They've been proven to work. Everybody knows they work. They're used in industrial applications. They're used in hospitals. They're used in all these sorts of places. And they work great. When you get into these other ones, they have a purpose, but I think they're over-applied. With UVC being one that works, it does work. Not a question that it works. It's just, A, you don't want to shine it on stuff like plastics, inner liners, a flex duct, those sorts of things. You don't want to be shining it on things that could potentially, because people will say, yeah, but now they make it so it doesn't break down. That may be true, but it still could break down enough to get into the air and create VOCs. And so we don't want to make a worse problem by shining UVC on things that can break down and get in our air. But it does do a really good job of irradiating coils and those sorts of things, so long as the customer understands the lifetime value of that. Now, UVC is one that is highly dubious that it's going to deal with coronavirus, though. It's really going to do a pretty good job with bacterial and fungal growth on an evaporator coil, which is certainly worthwhile. But that doesn't mean that it's going to address viruses in an airstream. And that, to me, is why people should stop selling it as a solution to that particular problem. I would much rather see people use HEPA filtration, which is proven to catch viruses. Of all of these, to deal with viruses, HEPA filtration is the one that is proven, absolutely proven, over and over and over again, to deal with viruses. What did I miss, Caleb or Reagan?
No, I think that was pretty thorough. I would add, though, that the fact that I think it's always good to have some sort of monitoring device that's looking at certain parameters that you're trying to solve for, but understand that you don't have a reference meter. There is no reference meter on the market that you can get that's affordable and that's practical to use in anyone's home. What you're using is an indicator measurement.
Right.
It's like I was just talking to somebody recently. It's like they told me how tall they were, it's an approximation that should prompt you to action. So high PVOC level doesn't necessarily mean that the level that it's measuring on that monitor is the actual measurement, because it's not going to be exact. You can never be exact, but it can prompt you to open up the windows to increase your ventilation through your ERV and your ventilating dehumidifier. That's an important distinction, because when you're going to sell a monitor, you have to have that caveat in there.
Yeah, true. And that is also, the more you fall down this rabbit hole, there's always going to be things that you don't have all the answers to. And what I'm advocating for is not having all the answers. I'm advocating for having a heck of a lot more answers that are readily available for your customers than just saying, hey, we sell XYZ brand of out-of-the-box $1,200 air purifier, and so that's what we tell all the customers that they need. That, to me, is a bad practice.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And if that is your end game, is just being able to have a lot of resource material to point your client to, then PCO and particle ionization and cold plasma, they don't have the resources in abundance that have been reviewed, and there's just not the volume of studies that is required to be able to confidently say that to a client. And so that would be where I would fall in hesitation with using some of those uh, selling practices that people use when trying to sell PCO and itemization.
Yep. And as we go on, feel free to call in and share your thoughts on this. If you have anything you want to add or anything that you think we're way off on. My biggest concern in the industry as it relates to these things, and because I think a lot of people wonder why I'm doing this, because it's like, well, hey, I'm putting in something, it's going to help. Who really cares how much? It's because there's so much misinformation that's being perpetrated by the manufacturers and the reps who are just trying to sell a product. And I don't fault them. I mean, that's their job to try to sell a product. But we need to be a lot more thorough in the questions and the questions that we ask, because in a lot of cases, this is what bothers me most, is that we could be helping. This list above, this list up top here, we could be helping with these, and rather often we throw these at them because they're easier to install and they have better profit margins. And that's what upsets me more than anything else. These don't really upset me as long as they're in their proper place. But what upsets me is that we're failing to use these, and those are the ones that we know work. So that's, I guess, mostly where I want to land, is that we can be helping people. It just takes more work, and we got to be willing to do the work. And that comes down to back to the whole thing about pricing again, too. If you're providing really good solutions for people, I think you should be able to charge better pricing. The problem is that often we're competing with, as contractors who want to provide really good solutions, with people who are throwing, quick, easy products at it that are, supposedly will solve all the world's issues, that are not as proven as these ones up top that are much more proven. So that's kind of my beef with it. I do want to ask you, Reagan, because I think you do offer some of these products. What are your thoughts on this? How far down the rabbit hole are you on this?
You there?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, we pretty much make it a practice to use large media filters, and that's the only thing that we'll recommend for every house. Just the bigger the media filter that we can. I'm starting to do a little bit more testing, just like you are, but I feel real reluctant to offer anything that I haven't played with myself. So we don't really. I mean, we'll offer UV lights every now and then, like for a dirty sock syndrome situation. But other than that, we've done a few of the bipolar ionizers, but just real hesitant until I start getting more testing and like you said, not necessarily laboratory testing, but just peer-reviewed stuff. Just us putting stuff out there, testing it in-house, and seeing how it goes.
Yeah, and for example, with bipolar, I'm not particularly concerned that bipolar is hurting anything. I'm a little bit dubious on how well it works. We've done some Petri dish tests where we've shown some good results and others that haven't been so great before and after with bipolar. Because we're doing a lot of this now. We're looking at PM 2.5 before, we're looking at it after, we're doing Petri dish tests before and after, which at the best are, there's a lot of different conditions. Those are not perfectly scientific tests. It's just what we would call a qualitative test versus a quantitative test. Just a basic look at, do we feel like we made a difference? Because in some cases, that's the best we've got. We don't have a lot other than that. So with people who like bipolar type systems, I'm fine with that. I just don't. I think you should be careful not to oversell them. That's all, because I think in a lot of cases they may not do much. But that's not to say that I know that for a fact. It's just that's my opinion, and so that firmly falls into the opinion category. And a lot of the testing that I've seen is sort of, there's a lot of little tricks that they use. So they'll like do the smoke box test where they run the bipolar inside of a box full of smoke and it takes the smoke out. So that's a tiny little box. They work really good on ice machines, as an example. So bipolar is a really good example, or cold plasma is an example that works really good in an application, and that application is ice machines. It's very contained. You have a lot of cases where you've got yeast and whatever that's growing all over the place in those ice machines, and that's really been unequivocally shown to work really well. So there's always and that's what I say. Like, a lot of these technologies have a role, they have a place. I just see them often being being misapplied, and instead people are missing the solutions that we know really work. And so this list here that we're looking at now, this is a list of things this is real indoor air quality. This is things that you can do. You can help with air balancing, make people more comfortable. You can keep the systems clean. That makes a difference. You can look at duct leakage. Duct leakage is huge because not only does return leakage bring in stuff from your attics and crawl spaces, but also if you have duct leakage on the positive side, it creates negative pressurization, which pulls in more outdoor air from undesigned places, which can cause, if you're pulling in outdoor air from your garage, for example, that can be have a lot of chemicals, toxic chemicals in it. Envelope leakage, sealing the envelope better. Sensors to look at things like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, PM 2.5. Those are all things that can help quite a bit. Humidity control. If your humidity is too low, bringing it up. If it's too high, bringing it down. That's proven to make a really big difference on indoor air quality. Bringing in outdoor air via ventilation and controlling that outdoor air so you're not bringing in too much or too little. I'm a really big fan of demand ventilation right now and basing it on either CO2 or a combination of CO2 and total VOCs. I think that's kind of the future. And then filtration and load matching are huge. We've always known that having equipment that's too big is bad for comfort, it's bad for indoor air quality, and so is filtration most of all. And the biggest thing, if there's anything I would love to see companies start to do, is spend a little more time and effort in providing larger surface area, high MERV filters, because when you have larger surface area, now you have lower face velocity. And so having a bigger filter is better even if the MERV rating is the same. But if you can do both, that's where it makes a huge difference. And that's what I really would love to see companies do, because if you look at the research that's been done by a company like Smart Air Filters, which it sounds like it's a company that's trying to sell you filters, but it's much more complicated than that. They're actually a company that helps provide solutions to third world countries. They've done a lot of testing on air filters, and they've shown that even regular MERV 11, MERV 12, MERV 13 air filters, when the face velocity is controlled properly, they can remove a lot of very small particles even better than we used to think that they did. And so a lot of things that you start to learn about air filters that makes you like it the more you learn about it. But again, Smart Air Filters, that's a really great website to look at as it relates to these topics. I'm going to get him back on to talk more about this because it's really good stuff. So here's some supporting info, some things. I've talked so much about this. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I agree with everything about the big filters, and I'm kind of on the same page with bipolar. I don't think it hurts any. I talked to Caleb about it a few times, asking him questions, but I don't think it hurts anything. It's just you have to be careful what you promise that it'll do, because, from what I understand, it helps large particles clump together, but all the other stuff as far as what it does to viruses and things like that are a little dubious for my taste.
Yeah, I'm not, and again, I don't want to hurt people's businesses by saying things don't work when I don't know that they don't work. All I know is what I've tested, and all I know is what I've seen, and all I know is the data I've looked at. And these are the best sources that I would suggest looking at, in addition to doing your own testing. The HomeChem study is great. There's a whole series of videos on Corbett Lunsford's YouTube channel that kind of followed the HomeChem study. A lot of it is a little over maybe an HVAC contractor's head, but it's a really good study that looked at chemicals inside the home. The Lawrence Berkeley study they did a study specifically on PCO and incomplete degradation and how it can create formaldehydes and aldehydes if it's improperly applied, or if there's other chemical reactions going on. Now, one thing I want to mention about PCO stands for photocatalytic oxidation. That means that you're using a photocatalyst, you're using some sort of a light, you're using light, you're shining it on a catalyst, and you're creating oxides that go out and oxidize, basically exchange electrons between atoms and molecules. And a lot of companies will say, well, we're not a PCO, and I dispute that. A lot of them that say that they're not a PCO are in fact using light in a catalyst in order to create oxides. And that's the question I would ask. Are you using light in a catalyst in order to create oxides? If you are, based on that phrase, I would say that you are a PCO. But again, this gets into legal territory and people start sending lawyers after me. So I'm not going to get into that. But Whenever you're sending out active oxidizers, I start to get a little uncomfortable because of some of the studies that have been done. The EPA Air Purifier Guide, if you read it, it compares different technologies, and it doesn't have a lot of good things to say about PCOs or ozone generating devices at all. So just take a look at that. Take a look at any independent data you can find. I'm always interested in finding new independent data, even if it goes against what I previously believed. This is an important thing, is that, sometimes you're going to find out things that are in opposition to what you previously thought, and you need to take that information and find out more about it rather than just accepting it. Look at real-life case studies with before and after data. That was actually one of the first times I was involved in a study that Aprilaire did back in the early 2000s on whole house dehumidifiers, because we were having a lot of issues after the hurricanes in Central Florida. And so actually, if you look at some of their white paper studies, they'll say Lake Mary or Central Florida as a place that they did some studies, and I was involved in the installation of that equipment, and I got to see the data as it was coming off the data loggers. And it convinced me, based on those real-life case studies, that there's a lot of benefit to using whole house dehumidification in really high latent environments like Central Florida. And so I'm a big fan of those sorts of studies, even though they're not necessarily super scientific, because the variables are always changing. Science is always trying to isolate specific variables, often in a lab, but I kind of like this field science where you're doing real-life case studies. And then as a contractor, just test in and test out as best you can. It's the same way. It's our policy that if we're going to change any ductwork within a house, a lot of times when we do a change-out, we're going to alter some ductwork. Test in and test out, meaning test what it was before, then make the change and test what it is after. Because unless you test in and test out, you don't know if you actually helped. And so more and more, I want to see us, my contracting business, and other contractors doing the testing that they can do, even if it's incomplete. But do the best testing you can before and after, and I think IAQ also falls into this category. If any of you want to call in and talk about indoor air quality or ask a question, we've got some really bright people. Caleb is a really good mind when it comes to this. He's done a lot of research. So if you want to ask any questions, feel free to call in now, because we're going to start moving on here pretty quick to Hardstart Kits. So you see the number up top. Feel free to call in if you got any questions, anything you want to holler about. So again, 914-205-5384 is the live call-in line. All right. And you're not going to call in and just immediately be talking to me like last time. You're gonna go through a process, and you'll know when you go live, because I got some feedback on that was a bit much, which I completely understand. All right. So we're gonna go over some things that we do quickly. I've got all of these. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I just want to show these. We've got these on our social media, Instagram, the Facebook page. You can take them. You can use them in your own companies. You can give them to your customers. Whatever you want to do is fine. I will admit that when I make these, I make them based on things that we do in our company. So it's kind of Florida-based, and obviously that's on purpose so that I can use it for you to share, but I can also use it in my own business. And these are the steps that I think we should think about. One would be use fewer chemicals in the first place, so you have fewer chemicals to remove. Next, get customers to start monitoring things like low-level carbon monoxide, CO2, VOCs 2.5. Control humidity, that's huge, especially in our market. That's why it's so high on the list, because in our market, that's enormous. Filter better, which is what we've talked about more than anything else. That I think we can improve as an industry is filtering better, and even making sure that we have fewer gaps and cracks around our filters. So larger surface area, lower face velocity, use bigger return grills, use 2-inch or 4-inch filters if you can. Get ones that have, if you have the ability to have the pressure drop, get ones that are high MERV and maybe even have some carbon in them. I like all of those things. You just have to look at what the pressure drop is going to be across it, but trick, if you make it bigger, you can use more restrictive filters. Ventilate, bring in more outdoor air, and then you can look at neutralizing. So then you can look at things like UVC, activated carbon, even PCO and bipolar if you want. But it's just, to me, all the way down at the bottom of that list after you've had all those conversations and been really thorough. Next is our healthy indoor air checkpoints. This is a long one. Someone's saying, hold on one second. Let's see here. Oh, okay, sorry. It was. I thought somebody was saying that they couldn't see it on YouTube. It's actually just talking about Eric getting into trouble on YouTube. Good old Eric Melly. By the way, Eric Melly is one of the smartest guys in the industry also, and we're very blessed and honored to have him here and as a technician at Kalos. I thank the good Lord every day for Eric Melly in my prayers. Okay, that might be a little extreme, but he's a great technician. So, yes, agreed. All right, so these are our indoor checkpoints, and these go well beyond the air conditioning equipment. So these are things like, again, considering an ERV or HRV, wireless flood detectors, venting your kitchen exhaust, properly venting bath fans, looking for moisture in attics, making sure that you're sealing around attic accesses. These are all the sorts of checkpoints that I think companies could be doing instead of selling expensive products that you can, just throw into a duct. I think if you start integrating these services, maybe they don't have the sizzle, but they have the steak. They actually make a difference with people's health. They're going to actually improve people's outcomes. These are things that are going to be worth it to look at. In our market, sealing lighting cans is a huge one because we have these attics, which are a huge moisture driver, and then you have all these unsealed recessed lights, and all that moisture and heat comes down through those, and that can be a big factor, not only from humidity, but also, attics are disgusting in the same way that crawl spaces often are. And we want to keep that stuff from getting into the house. It's one thing to get in the house with an nice open window or an open door. That sort of infiltration isn't as big of a deal as having it sucked through an attic where it's dirty and there's feces of animals and all that sort of stuff, which is just nasty. All right, and then this is sort of our ideal setup in our market. You have a HEPA filter. You have a dehumidifier that's bringing in outdoor air through an ECM blower box. That part is the most questioned part that we have here because people don't understand why we have that. I have that because otherwise you're just relying on the negative static of the dehumidifier in order to pull outdoor air in, and often that's not enough to bring in the designed amount. And so you can actually dial in the CFM on this blower box in order to bring in exactly what you need. And it also reduces the total return static for the dehumidifier, which means it moves more air and just all in all works better. Now, you could overdo it, and you could actually push too much air through so that it wasn't being dehumidified properly. And that's why it's important to really dial in your system so that you're checking what your enthalpy is going in and out. You're checking your dew point in and out of your dehumidifier under kind of worst case scenario conditions to make sure that it's all working properly. A lot of testing goes into this, but this is for our market, a really good setup. You've got the nice MERV filter, you've got the HEPA filter, and then if you want to add a UV into the air handler, then that can work great. But this is a really nice indoor air quality setup that frankly costs a lot of money, and you make really good margins when you install this properly. But to me, that actually provides a real value to people. And if they spend the money for that, they're actually going to get an outcome that's measurable and that's going to do a really nice job for them. So those are some things to look at there. All right, so we've come to the end of that section. So nobody called in. Nobody has anything to say about indoor air quality. I guess we've already talked about it enough. I'm already going to warn you that this episode is going to go just a touch long. If you want to call in, that's the number to call in. But we're going to move on now to Hardstart Kits. Anything else you want to add, Reagan or Caleb? Anything I missed? I guess that's a big no. Fair enough.
Nope.
All right. I think it's kind of getting into the point where I'm beating this dead horse so much that everybody's like, okay, we get it. We get the point. But these are things that I still get questions about all the time. Actually, these two things are the things I get the most flack and the most questions about. And so that's the reason why I'm addressing it again. So that way, when I get the questions, I can send them to this video. Yeah, boy, Daniel says fair enough. Yeah, I say fair enough a lot. That's one of my phrases. I'm not actually sure where I got that from. Somebody I know says that a lot.
Actually,
it might be Bert. I say actually a lot too. Yeah. But hey, it's endearing. I think if I stopped doing it, you would all miss it, and then it's one of those things. If I ever was hit in the head with a meteor and you were all at my funeral, I hope there'll be lots of fair enoughs and actuallys in remembrance of me. All right, so we're going to talk about Hardstart Kits, which is Start Cap and Potential Relay. Yeah, I don't know if you could all hear that. They've got some sound effects that they're using against me now. Hardstart kits, start caps potential relay, or PTCR. And so a PTCR is a positive temperature coefficient relay. I'm going to pull this away so you can actually see this, and that is sort of a even less expensive version of a hard start, and that's what we've got here. You've all seen this little carrier doodad. They had some that were, I think, blue at one point, and then you have the Super Boost from Supco. That's an example. A lot of them are PTCRs. I think some of them actually have capacitors in them nowadays, but these are all what we would call start gear, and what I want to do is get you to the place where you understand the differences between these, and hopefully don't misapply them, because this is a really key place where I'm not against hard start kits. I get this reputation of being against things because I am against people who misapply them, and I'm not against them at all. What I'm against is the misinformation that goes into their use. So let's start with how they're wired, because I think this is an area that hopefully I can get you to understand more about run capacitors and start capacitors pretty quickly. So this is a diagram actually from the Carrier factory hard start kit. And the main thing to understand is that your start capacitor is really just wired in parallel with your run capacitor. So it's additive on top of your run capacitor. And so let's imagine that this start capacitor wasn't here. Let's just imagine. We don't have a start capacitor now. Okay, all we have is a run capacitor. If all we have is a run capacitor, and then we take our run capacitor out of the circuit, okay, we take the run capacitor out of the circuit, what happens to the current on the start winding, right? We have two windings in a compressor. I'm sorry if I talk about this so often, so if you've heard me say this like a million times, I apologize. But there's two windings in a compressor, and then there's a common connection point. So C is not a winding in a single-phase motor. It's just a common connection point between your run and start winding. So if we remove the run capacitor, what happens to the start winding? Because again, your run capacitor is run in series here with your start winding. Were you going to say something, Caleb? No? Reagan? Somebody somewhere?
Yeah. I've got Joe Fiducio.
Okay, Joe's on. All right,
yeah.
Let's go ahead. Yeah, before I move on, let's bring Joe on.
Yeah. All right.
Hey, Joe, what's going on?
Can you hear us, Joe?
I got you. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So I was kind of like in a green room. I didn't get to hear any of the useful information you just went over for the past 10 minutes, but I had a question in chat, and it's something I've been interested in. Hemp is a big thing now. It's slowly starting with the building construction, and it's utilized in fibers. It's really got a good sense of pulling CO2 out. So I wanted to find out, from the masses, what are thoughts about utilizing it in our filtration fibers? Does it pose a benefit? Does it pose any type of harm? What do y'all think?
About hemp fiber specifically, I haven't seen any studies about it absorbing CO2. CO2 is actually a natural constituent part of the air. And it's not even, I don't know of anything that absorbs CO2 other than live organisms, or something that's actually oxidizing it in some way or combining it with something else molecularly. So I've never heard that. I have no problem with industrial hemp. I think it's a really nice thing that's happened in industry as we're starting to use it more and more. It has a lot of utility. There's a lot of really good technologies that surround it already, but I would be interested in finding out more. If you have any studies or anything to share, I'd be interested in that. Do you know anything about that, Caleb?
I don't. I have actually done a little bit of reading up on it, but I have not been able to find any studies that specifically point to efficacy or how people are drawing the conclusion that it's absorbing CO2. So I'm just as interested as you in this regard.
Yeah, I did YouTube dive as far as hempcrete, and the building materials and how it apparently absorbs the CO2. So that is what's being pushed for.
Oh, okay. I understand. Okay, I understand what you're talking about. So what they're talking about is that industrial hemp acts as a CO2 sink. I think this is what they're talking about, Caleb. And the idea is that the plants, because they're carbon-based life forms, as they grow, they actually bring in CO2. We know that about plants, right? They bring in CO2. So if you use hemp fibers rather than whatever the traditional concrete fibers are, that you're sequestering CO2. And that's more of an environmental question. It's not a question about, when I talk about indoor air quality, I'm thinking more in terms of ambient CO2 inside a space. They're talking about reducing overall CO2 in the environment, which is sort of a different question. But yeah, it's an interesting one. And that kind of ties into the whole question about carbon credits and carbon taxation and all that, and reducing carbon ambient in the atmosphere. But yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense now, what you're saying.
Yeah, and just utilizing that on a big aspect, say, you are dealing with a skyrise situation where you've got one massive blower and you want to get as much CO2 out of the air as possible, utilizing not just the clothing fibers, but the plant as itself. It could benefit our industry, couldn't, but it's something I've been thinking about. And it kind of played into here with, CO2 talk.
I would be interested to know the metrics and actually quantifying the efficacy of that, because it's undisputed that hemp and any other plants is going to absorb carbon dioxide as a form of photosynthesis, but I'd be curious to know if that rate, because it's been proven that having living plants inside of homes for the purpose of air purification is not effective. So I'd be curious to know if this particular process is effective at all.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So let's move on from that, though. Did you have a question? It says here something about Hardstart Kits. Did you have anything to add on Hardstart Kits, Joe?
Oh, like I said, I kind of didn't really get the information, so I really don't know what you went over. But with my position, I get a lot of younger techs. Are they good? Are they bad? My position is they have their place. If you've got a failing compressor and it's literally hard start and it gets you by, yeah, it does good. And until you can replace that compressor, it serves its purpose. They're pushed in my area as, if you have dim lighting, a hard start's going to fix it. It's not a fix, like people say it is. It's being marketed as one thing, but, it could potentially do a little bit of damage over a long period of time.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going to cover here. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it has a role. Using a hard start kit as a tool in order to get a compressor that is locked running. I don't think anybody would dispute the value there. I've used them all the time throughout my career, and I think that's a perfect value. The question is more installing them as a way to optimize system performance, and that's where it gets a little dubious. But there are still applications for that as well. So that's what we're going to cover next. But yeah, thanks for calling in, Joe. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, so I wanted to focus on this question of the start winding. So it's one tricky thing is that the run capacitor is also wired in series with the start winding, and then your start capacitor is wired in parallel with your run capacitor. Hang with me here. Let's just make this really simple. When your run capacitor fails, okay, what happens to the current on your start winding? And the answer is if you have no hard start kit, it's just a run capacitor, your current on your start winding goes to 0. Why? Because when all you have is a run capacitor, the only way for current to go in and out of this start winding, again, up here, this start winding right here, the only way for current to go in and out of this start winding is for current to pass in and out of this capacitor. Now, a capacitor, the current doesn't pass through it. It just stores on the same side that it came in at, and it goes back. It's like a balloon, kind of. If you imagine it being like a balloon, it allows it to store, and then it releases, store, and release. And it does that every time you have a cycle change in the alternating current. And so that's why we use them. So they store and they release, and it creates a phase shift, but it also is what allows current to move through your start winding. If you don't have a capacitor here, if this capacitor is open, it's failed open, then you have no current going through your start winding. And that's why your compressor doesn't start when you have a failed run capacitor and no hard start kit, right? Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. If you have any questions about that, you can pull that up in chat, because this is something I talk about a lot, and I think sometimes I lose people. But when you go up to a system that's not working, the run capacitor is bubbled up like a toad. It is causing you to actually break the circuit on your start winding, and you have no current in your start winding, right? Okay. So when you add in a start capacitor, what are you doing? You're adding in this big old start capacitor, generally electrolytic. It has really high capacitance, and you're running it through a start relay, which is a potential relay. And what happens is when your back EMF gets high enough, then it opens up this contact in your potential relay, and it takes the start capacitor right here out of the circuit. Your run capacitor stays in the circuit. It just takes the start capacitor out of the circuit. Why does it do that? Why doesn't the start capacitor just stay in all the time? I'm going to ask some very basic questions here, right? What happens if we were to just remove the potential relay and just wire it across the line and leave it in all the time? What would happen? Not a trick question. Your compressor would burn up, right? What would burn up in your compressor? Specifically, your start winding would burn up in your compressor. Why would your start winding burn up in your compressor? Because that start capacitor would be allowing too much current to move through that start winding, and the start winding isn't designed for it. Now, a lot of people will say, well, it's because this start capacitor is somehow, allowing this extra current to move through that start capacitor, through that start winding. A start capacitor cannot allow more current to move through the start winding than is present based on the voltage that already exists. Okay, so when you have a run winding, your run winding is already connected across the line. It's connected from one side to the other side of your contactor, right? And that's what we're showing here. So it's already connected across the line. Let me pull a different diagram up here that may be a little easier to see. So your run winding and your common are connected directly across the line. Your start winding is not connected across the line. It's connected through a run capacitor or a run capacitor and a start capacitor. So when you put a start capacitor in, it allows more current to move through the start winding for a short period of time. People say it creates a bigger phase shift. It creates a bigger phase shift just because there's more current moving through it. That's all there is. It's just a bigger phase shift because there's more current. It's bigger capacitance, and so you're allowing more current to move through the start winding. When you allow more current to run through the start winding, what happens to the start winding? Does it stay the same temperature, or does it get hotter? Answer is it gets hotter, Bob. And so it gets hotter, but it only gets hotter for a short period of time, right? Because we're taking it back out of the circuit. Well, what happens if this potential relay contact doesn't open fast enough? It overheats, right? What happens if it opens exactly when it's supposed to open? Is it still hotter or cooler in the start winding? It's still hotter, just for a very short period of time. So what are we doing when we connect a start capacitor? People always say, well, we create a bigger phase shift. You're creating more current through the start winding. More current is moving through the start winding. When you move more current through the start winding, you can get the compressor started faster. Do you get this compressor started with less current? Well, no, that's crazy. You're not starting it with less current. You're moving more current through the start winding. Now, less current is going through the run winding over a period of time because you're getting it started quicker. Because if you don't start it quicker, what happens? It stays in lock rotor longer, stays at higher current longer, which is borne by your run winding. Here's a thing that you should do sometime. Take an amp clamp, because we always measure our current on common. So we're putting our clamp up here. But instead of measuring it on common, instead check run and start and see what your current is. You're going to notice that your start current is going to be generally lower than your run current, even while running. But now do it on lock rotor. So put your meter, your amp clamp on the lock rotor mode, and then connect it in rush current and see what it is. I said locked rotor mode. There's no such thing as a locked rotor mode. There's inrush current. Put it on inrush and measure. Your inrush is going to be on your run winding if you don't have a Hardstart kit. If you have a Hardstart kit, you'll notice that you have inrush on your run winding and your start winding if you have a meter that's good enough to catch it that fast. A lot of meters aren't even going to catch how quickly that occurs before that potential relay opens. So what's really happening with a Hardstart kit? It gets the compressor started faster. That's why your lights don't dim as much. That's why you don't see as high of an inrush current on your common with your meter, is not because it's actually lower current. It's because it's happening so fast that your meter isn't seeing it, which is why, depending on which meter you use, you'll see a really big difference in inrush current, because some catch it quicker and some aren't quite as quick. And so what I would rather see, if you look at this on an oscilloscope, you'll see this, but I would rather see meters that actually showed how long it took to start. That's actually more valuable information than what the number is, because the number isn't valid anyway, because you're not seeing the real number. It's happening so quickly that your meter's not seeing the real number of inrush. So here's the point. When you put a hard start on, what are you doing? Putting more current through your start winding. Say it with me. When you put a hard start on, what are you doing? You're putting more current through your start winding. There are manufacturers out there who say that this is going to help protect your start winding. No. When you have start winding failure is often caused by a failed potential relay. Why? If this potential relay sticks shut, what happens? Too much current on start winding all the time. Start winding fails. You put too big of a run capacitor on. What will happen? Too much current on start winding. Start winding fails. What happens if you pull all the capacitors out? Does your start winding fail? No. Your start winding doesn't fail because it doesn't have any current moving through it. What happens? Your run winding fails. Why? Because the compressor stays locked and now your run winding is the one that gets hot. So under normal circumstances, when a compressor is going out on internal overload, you hear it go the What's getting hot? The run winding. Why isn't it the start winding? Well, the start winding is getting hot too, but not nearly so much if it has only a run capacitor in place, because that run capacitor acts as a limiter of current. Just check it sometime. Check what your current is on your start winding. Let me show you what this looks like on an oscilloscope. All right, now these tests were done by Kickstart, so by RectorSeal. They did these with an oscilloscope, and you'll notice they did them at low voltage conditions. So pay close attention whenever you're looking at these sorts of tests at the voltage that's being used for the test. So here's one with no hard start device in place. It's the same compressor model number. These are Bristol reciprocating compressors, and this one is with a Kickstart in place, right? All right, now notice what happens. Run winding current is really high. So the blue one, I have to define this. The blue is run winding and the red is start winding. So without a hard start kit, it's staying locked, because again, it's low voltage here condition. It's staying locked, and so you have this really high run winding current. So what's going to happen with this? Well, it's going to go at an internal overload, and if anything's going to fail, it's going to be the run winding. Look at the start winding. It's got barely anything going through it. Why? Because that run capacitor is acting as a limiter. Now take the same compressor, put a start kit on it. What happens? You see a drop in your current on your run winding because your compressor is getting started so quickly. But look at what happens to the current in your start winding. It's greater. The red has greater current. Now what really happens? The thing gets started within 100 milliseconds. And so it's getting started quicker. That's good, right? This is actually a case where a hard start kit makes a lot of sense, right? It actually helped get the compressor started quicker. But notice, 197 volts, that's really low. So, of course, this is kind of a key application for hard start kits. Take a look here. Now we're at 187 volts with a factory hard start kit. Look at what happens. Because our voltage is so low, we have this pretty high current on the start winding, and we have high current on the run winding until it gets started. And once it gets started, now this is the moment that potential relay opens up and takes that hard start kit out. And now your start winding amperage drops big time. That's why that happens. So again, you don't have lock rotor amps on your start winding unless you have a hard start kit in place, period. Or you have some crazy oversized run capacitor. Because the run capacitor, the only current that can move through your start winding is dictated by how much current can enter and leave that balloon that is your capacitor. And when you're adding in a start capacitor, you're adding in a much bigger balloon, so that a lot more current can move in and out of that start winding. What are the challenges? Let's talk about that quickly. And if any of you want to call in, feel free. We're running pretty long tonight because these are two topics that I like to talk about, but feel free to call in. What is the purpose of a hard start kit? Hard start kit helps to get the compressor to full speed quick. That's good. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with getting the compressor to full speed quick, but just recognize what you're doing in order to do that. You're doing that by adding more current to the start winding. It assists in cases of high starting torque or low voltage conditions. So you got a locked compressor, that's high starting torque. If you've got a compressor that is having to start under a lot of head pressure, that's high starting torque. Long line applications, low voltage, those are cases where a hard start kit makes sense. And the manufacturers are generally going to tell you when that makes sense. You got a lot of light flicker, it can help with that a little bit, but it's not helping with it because it's really reducing current instantaneously. It's just reducing the amount of time that it takes to get started. So those are all perfectly fine purposes. But hard starts don't decrease the instantaneous starting amps. They just don't. In fact, they increase it. They don't reduce stress on the compressor universally, meaning that if you take a compressor that's starting perfectly fine as it is with just its run capacitor, by making that start winding hotter, that's not going to universally reduce the stress on the compressor. And it's not going to decrease start winding failure, it's going to increase start winding failure. And the most common reason is because the run capacitor will fail. As we know, run capacitors fail all the time. And when that run capacitor fails, what happens? Well, now you don't have the run capacitor in place, so it gets started, and then it stalls again, and this ramps up again, and so you keep getting these spikes of start amps. Start winding amps, I should say. And so your start winding's taking this big hit that it was never designed to take when you have a hard start kit in place with a failed run capacitor. Now, I'm really proud of AMRAD, American Radionic, that came out with this new run capacitor that actually has a terminal on it so that when the run capacitor fails, it takes out the hard start kit. And that was a really good design, and that makes a lot of sense. And so with theirs, and they're not sponsors or anything anymore, we worked with them for a while, but I toured their factory. It's pretty rad up in Palm Coast, Florida, a really good company. And so when their run capacitor fails, it will also take out the start capacitor, shut the system off, and that's a really nice design. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So what are the hard start issues? Improper selection is a huge issue. So people using aftermarket hard start kits as a one-size-fits-all solution. It could have too high of capacitance, which could make the start winding overheat. It could be that the potential relay is not pulling out quick enough. I had a illustration, I forgot to put it in here, of all the different sizes of relay coils, all the different sizes of start capacitors, that carrier specs for different brands, just one brand. There's so many different sizes, and that's because a hard start kit, in order to really be a perfect match, has to be perfectly designed for that compressor. And so these aftermarket ones that we're using, I'm not saying don't keep them on the truck. I have them on my van right outside. But I'm mostly using that in cases where we've got an older system that's having a hard time starting, and usually that's because of under voltage conditions. That's a really common one. But again, hard start issues, improper selection. If the run capacitor fails, it causes compressor issues, and it does increase start winding stress. It just does. It can reduce run winding stress because it's starting quicker, so the run winding's not taking as much. But it does increase your start winding stress. So what are some things that I like better? So in terms of talking about selling, in terms of talking about things that we can offer to our customers, this is what I'm encouraging you in doing. The ones that I really like, the solutions that I think are really good and are really worthwhile, are solutions that are going to take a little bit more thought, are going to take a little bit more time to apply, but can actually make a really big difference. Surge protection properly installed with voltage monitoring is a really nice value, and we've seen that over and over again. We were having all kinds of failures on some of these new inverter-driven pieces of equipment. We started putting the ICM 493 on with over voltage and under voltage monitoring, as well as surge protection with multiple metal oxide varistors, and it really reduced those occurrences. Again, not a sponsor, just a product that we use. Same thing with Rector Seal, not a sponsor, a product that Caleb installed. I really like what they're doing with the vacuum tube technology in order to protect the MOVs, to make them last longer. I think that's a nice thing that they're doing there. Again, we have to look at the longevity of the product over time, but I like what they're doing. Surge protection and voltage monitoring seem to make a big difference, especially if you're in a market that has a lot of power surges, has a lot of lightning. That is an upsell that is a value to a lot of people, especially if they've got higher end equipment that's worth protecting. Factory hard starts when they were supposed to be installed in the first place. So if you show up on a unit and that unit was supposed to have a factory hard start because of the installation conditions, then absolutely quote to install a factory hard start. At the same time, I would suggest if you're going to use a hard start, look at that new AMRAD run capacitor. We're not currently using it right now because we don't do a lot of hard start kits, but if I was going to do more hard start kits, I would look at bundling it with that, and now that seems like a nice solution in cases where the equipment already calls for it. Because now, if your run capacitor fails, you're not going to keep cycling on and off on the hard start. You're not going to keep getting that big hit in your start winding, which could potentially take your compressor out. And that's the problem that I have with hard start kits. They solve a problem, but they can also cause a problem. And often, people will sell them as this, oh, hey, it's going to help your compressor run better. It's going to decrease your power costs, all that. That's not true in a lot of cases and potentially could cause compressor failure. Somebody asked, does 521 save energy actually? 521 is a brand name. I'm not going to say it does not save energy, but I will say that the amount of energy that it saves is infinitesimal. It is not a valid reason to sell one. A valid reason to sell one is a case where the compressor is actually having a hard time starting. Thus the name Hardstart Kit. Not one that you just sell to people because, hey, it's going to help your compressor last longer. Could it help in some cases? Sure, but you're gambling. You're throwing dice at that point. Disconnect repair and replacement. Those are areas, and again, it depends on if your license allows you to do that. Ours does. Disconnects are often, have poor contacts. They're falling apart. They have, gaps and cracks where water's gotten in and are rusting out. Those are things that are worth looking at and replacing when they need replacement. Again, I'm just saying, here's some offerings that I would rather you give other than selling people hard start kits. Wiring repair and protection. If you've got wires that are sagging down by the compressor discharge line, get those strapped up inside the cabinets, zip tying everything together, making it so things aren't rubbing and coming apart. Those are services that I think are much more valid than throwing a hard start kit. Now, it doesn't have the sizzle of selling them a compressor protector, and I get that, but it's, again, you got to know what you're doing. And if the manufacturer told you to put one in the first place and there's not one in there, then go ahead and get the manufacturer one and put that in, especially if it's a piece of equipment you installed or it's a relatively new piece of equipment. And then consider getting that run capacitor from AMRAD with that disconnect on it. I forget the term that they use on that new run capacitor, but it's a really good design for that. And then run capacitor testing. Run capacitor testing is valid. A lot of people will say, I'm not going to replace it. Run capacitor is either good or bad. No, it's not. Run capacitors do absolutely get weak, and it's a matter of how metal film capacitors are built. The metal film breaks down on the inside, and they do begin to get weak. And when they get weak, what happens? Well, your compressor is going to run less efficiently, because your start winding does rely on that capacitor in order to move the right amount of current through it. And too little current while it's running is also a problem, because now your run winding is bearing more of that load, and you're going to tend to get run winding failure. You're going to have a compressor that runs hotter, less efficient. That will make a difference on your power bill, having a capacitor that's outside of spec. Now, I am not going to quote a customer for anything unless it's above 10% out of spec, because plus or minus 6 on a lot of capacitors, plus or minus 5, plus or minus 6, is what is allowable right out of the box for that capacitor. That's not to say it's failed if it's outside of that. It's just saying that's what it has to be right out of the box. A lot of people use the under load testing that I talk about. Just be really careful with that under load testing, because you have to have a very accurate amp clamp and you have to make sure that your wire isn't picking up interference. Don't replace a run capacitor because it's reading high. If your run capacitor is reading high in an underload test, meaning you're doing the amperage voltage, 2652 test, and we talk about it all the time, which I'm not doing here, but look it up on the website. If you're doing that test and you're coming up with a higher microfarad value, don't replace that capacitor. What's happening is your amp clamp is picking up some interference and it's causing you to read high, or your amp clamp's just reading high. Some of them just read high. And so you got to be really, really careful with that. In fact, it's to the point now where I tell people, do the underload test, but if it looks weird, go ahead and do the bench test anyway. The bench, a lot of people believe underload testing is more accurate than bench testing. I'm finding because of the inaccuracy of clamps, it's actually more accurate to bench test in a lot of cases. And I'm the one who's been talking about this. Again, it's this whole thing about when you find out new information, you got to change your tune a little bit. I'm just finding that as we do it more and more, I'm getting more and more technicians coming back and saying, well, hey, the underload test shows it bad, but then when I do it on the bench, it shows it good. If it shows it good on the bench, just rely on the bench. I know a lot of people say, well, hey, underload is more realistic. It is, but you're still relying on a measurement that's really hard to take accurately, and that's a low amperage measurement, a low current measurement with a clamp is hard to accurately take. And so those are things to think about. Hoser HVAC says, Brian, what about relying on power factor only? Same thing, though, because even with a power factor meter like Redfish, which I love, you're not always going to get a really accurate measurement there. And I hate to say it, but as I've tested it, there's just cases where it works really well and cases where it doesn't work as well. And so I think you can use it in cases where you're going to be making, like, for example, if you don't have a you don't know what the right size capacitor is and you can't read it anywhere and you can't read the models and serial numbers or whatever, then I would say, you can use that to kind of guesstimate what the right capacitor should be. And again, I don't think it's a bad measurement. I just think we've got a lot to learn about it still in the accuracy that it takes to measure it well. And so, again, good technicians, they know what they know, but they also know that there's so much that we don't know, and there's so much that we're relying on instruments to give us these readouts, and you have to question your instruments. You have to double check things sometimes. And so if you're getting weird readings, always double check. And always, grab a different tool and check against that. If you have questions, ask. And yeah, so do I mind you using, to answer the question, do I mind you using a power factor meter in terms of like doing a maintenance, just saying, hey, is my capacitor working fine? Yeah, I think that's fine. But I'm not going to use that in a case where I really suspect my capacitor has an issue. I'm still going to use either underload test and then bench test ultimately if I'm questioning what I'm getting. Because bench test is not a bad way of measuring it if you have a good quality meter. And that comes down to the way that test is actually taken. So we didn't get very many callers. I think I scared you all off last time. Hopefully you found this helpful. I sure enjoyed having you here. We had quite a few of you here, which is pretty cool. I'll leave the call-in up for just a couple minutes. If any of you do want to call in the next few minutes, that would be great. But otherwise, we are wrapping up here. Let me see if I have any other slides. No, that is it. So my main encouragement to everybody as it relates to upsells or anything like that, I'm fine with you charging a good, solid price for things. I'm happy for you if you make a really good profit margin. But don't sell people things without understanding what you're selling them to the best of your ability, having done your research. Communicate clearly with your customers if there's cases where the solution that you're providing isn't a perfect solution, but it's helping with a particular issue. Be like a doctor. A doctor doesn't give you medication and say, hey, take this prescription. It solves everything. It's the perfect solution to everything. No, they tell you it'll help with this, but you could have these side effects. Watch out for this, watch out for that. That's the way that a doctor discusses these things. And it's the way that I would like to see you think about, think about what you're doing. Think about things that you're offering to your customer, because there's very few one-size-fits-all solutions. Things have applications. They have things that they're good for. And that's the way that I want you to think about this. We got a caller coming in here in a second, so I'm going to keep going until we get the, we dropped the caller now. We do this every Saturday. At least that's the goal. I'll tell you on social media if I'm not going to do it, and then it won't show up. But generally speaking, we're going to do this every Saturday at 8 p.m. I've got a bunch of these coming up. One thing to mention, look at today's tech tip. If you're on the tech tip emails, look at that. We've got a bunch of trainings coming up that are going to be really good. We got one with John Pastorello on leak detection. If you've taken a look at their leak detection guide, it's a really good guide. We're going to go through a lot on pressure testing and electronic leak detection, as well as just good old-fashioned, bubble leak detection, best practices, brazing best practices, flaring, all that. We've got another great class that I'm doing on processes, which is going to be a really weird class. I'm working with a guy who I actually had on my very first podcast, 6 years ago, something like that. It was a goofy podcast called The Wow Small Business, where I talk to other small business owners, and he talks about how to develop business processes, but specifically for AC companies, how to build processes internally for your business. And I'm going to share a lot of our processes using the software that he built, and so you're going to have a chance to get exclusive access to that in that training. And again, with that training, there is a software that you can choose to buy for your business if you want, but it'll be valuable to you either way. I'll give it to you as PDFs. The goal here is to give you great free training that you can use in your day-to-day. And if there's anything that I ever say that you don't like or you question, you can always email me, brian@hvacrschool.com. And hopefully next week we'll get more callers. This is our call-in line. It's going to remain the same every week, so you can call in and share your opinion as well. So thank you all so much. Have a blessed rest of your weekend. Enjoy yourself, relax, and we'll talk to you next time on the HVAC School Podcast.